Hi, this is Evan Lewis back again, and it's season 4 in New Zealand. And I decided to tell you today about a piece of software that I wrote that's online and you might find quite useful. It's free. So what does this do? This is for calculating the gear trains that are used on South Bend type lathes. And some of these lathes have a gearbox on them to where you can select one of 40 different gear positions, which covers most of your threads per inch that you might need, or pitch. This is the Model A has the gearbox, but the Model B and C do not. And so for them it's even more difficult because they have to work out the exact gear train to use to produce the number of threads per inch they want. And this software will actually help both users. It'll allow you to calculate pitches that are and threads per inch that are rather unusual. And actually it all started because one of the members on the Boxford users group asked how to produce 19 threads per inch, which is the pitch or threads per inch on the British Standard pipe quarter inch, I believe. The 1/8 inch British Standard pipe's 27 inch threads per inch too, which is a bit odd. So that's the kind of thing that the program can help you with. It actually does it by taking your selection of change wheel gears and compound gears as two separate lists, and looks at every permutation and combination of these gear wheels, every way in which you could put them together, and works out how many threads per inch or pitch that you would get with this particular combination, compares it with what you're looking for, and if it's within so many percentage marks of that point, it'll then report that particular set of gears as being a possible solution to your problem. And if you have a large number of gears, it can get well over 1 million different possible permutations and combinations of these gears that it needs to work through. But for a computer, that's not too big a problem. It takes a few seconds and comes up with the answer. So probably at this point, with no further ado, it's probably best just to show you the program. So if you go to the website, this is what you see. And this is actually the URL of the website you need to go to. It's called herosteamengine.com/RideTheGearTrain. And each of the words has to have a capital letter at the beginning, or actually it'll forward you to the right address if you don't use the right capital letters. So you just go to that webpage and you'll come up with this. Of course, you can contact me if you wish. I've got a few recommendations there. So this is the data entry. First question is, do you have a gearbox? Do you have a gearbox fitted on your lathe, yes or no, Model A or B and C? By the way, this is the terminology used by South Bend lathes. It's now used also by all the different clone manufacturers. And apparently there are about 22 different manufacturers that have made clones of the South Bend since South Bend first came out with it in 1933. And the particular clone that I'm using is Boxford, but there are many others as well. Okay, so that's the screw cutting gearbox question, and the next one is what type of lathe, is it imperial or metric? And again, this is pretty much standardized across all these different clones. And what kind of thread are you wanting to cut, an imperial or metric? And are you going to use compound gears? Actually, if you're going to convert from imperial to metric, you really need to use compound gears. It gives you a lot more options. And then they want to know what pitch you're going to use. Pitch for metric and threads per inch for imperial. And while we're on that topic, the lathes have a lead screw in them, which drives the tool along and creates the thread. And the imperial lathes have a lead screw with 8 threads per inch, and the metric have a pitch of 3 millimeters on the lead screw. And that's taken into account in the software. So those are all the entries you need to put in just to get some results, but there are various different things that you can play with. Here are some optional entries. One of them, you can vary the amount of percentage. Now you remember I was saying that it just tries out all the different gear combinations. Some of them will get 100% perfect match and they'll be reported with 0% error, while others will be slightly off, maybe only 0.1 or 0.01%. And if they're close enough for your satisfaction, you can use those. And so here you can specify what level of percentage you're happy with using. And if you have a low level of percentage, you get fewer results, and of course if you put the percentage up higher, it'll find more of them. And actually sometimes you get thousands of outputs, so it's not a bad idea to have a restriction to limit how many results you're prepared to look at. Now here's another optional extra, is that the change gears you can change that you use to create the gear trains. You can add extra gears in there if you want to. So you just type a list separated by commas, like for example, say 50, 56, you might have 2 extra gears, you can put them in there. And if you say, no, don't delete the existing gear train or gear selection, that'll be added on to the existing list. But if you say yes, it'll delete the existing list of gear wheels and only use the ones that you're providing. And you may actually be interested in what a particular gear does and what pitch, whether you can get the results you want with a particular gear, and you can just put one gear in there and see what happens. And then you have the compound gears, and for an imperial lathe converting to metric, you'd use a 127 gear and a 100 gear, but you can use anything you like, of course, in here, and that'll give you a wider range of selections. So I'll say no, don't delete my lists, so we can do some demos. And when you've got all the data ready, you just click submit the ticket to Ride, or otherwise you can read some information about it. Let's just go ahead and look at some results. So this is just the usual blurb, and the results show that the gear settings to produce a thread with 4 threads per inch and less than 0.5% error show they found 120 results and went through 68,640 gear combinations. One of the best on my list is 103, and 30 of these are exact results. So if you look through, you find here this is a thread per inch that it actually comes up with. Sometimes it's exactly 4, in which case your error is 0%. There's quite a few zeros down here, so you can actually get a combination which is going to be dead accurate. And to do that, you set up this gear train, which we'll talk about later, and you put the gearbox on A1 setting. And so it just goes through all the different permutations and combinations of different gear sizes here, trying to find which ones would give you the results that you might want. There's a rather large selection of gears available in the program, and you may in fact only have a few of these. In that case, you can just put in your own list and just get results that match what you need. And to summarize things, there's a table of the gears that we use. So this is actually my list, which is built into the program, with all the known available teeth on the gears that you can get for the main gears, and then there's another set for the compound gears, which we'll talk about. And this is some values that are assigned to the gearbox, which we'll come to later too. In the imperial gearbox, you have a lever which is labeled A, B, C, D, E, and I've assigned numbers to these. These are values, as I call them. So A has a value of 1 and D has a value of 8. You can see they're going up in powers of 2. 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8, 2 times 8 is 16. That's just the way it's done. It's not particularly relevant, really. And then there's a lever with numbers on them, and those numbers are assigned values as well, which I've worked out. 8, 9, 10, 11, 11.5, 12, 13, and 14. Letter A is assigned 1, and number 4 is assigned 11. So 1 times 11 is 11 threads per inch. Now, if you're using a standard setup, that would give you 11 threads per inch, but if you alter the gear train on the back of the lathe, it makes all kinds of different other combinations, and in this case makes 4 threads per inch. Once you've done a run and you've had a look at the results, you might want to make some changes, so you can go back to your data entry page and make whatever changes you want to your specifications. Particularly, you might want to change the gear wheels or the percentage and try again. If you need further information, click on Instructions and Information. That's it here. How to choose an acceptable error, which we mentioned, typically about 0.5% or maybe even less. Here's a set of little gear wheels that we use. And here's a compound one. Now the compound one has 2 gear wheels that are riveted together here. So if one turns, the other one turns with it. This one's got 63 you can read on the top of here, and the other one is 80, and that gives you a conversion to metric. And with a combination like that, 63 and 80, used on this high school lathe that I used when I was in high school, that's a standard setup with 56 teeth on the lead screw gear, and you can change the stud gear to get different threads per inch, or actually millimeters pitch for metric. This is some of the terminology that's used. Showing the back of the lathe, and we've got back gear, of course, the lever here. That's not really relevant. This is the main spindle. It's got the chuck on the other end, and it goes through these 2 gears here called the tumbler gears, and they reverse the direction of the stud gear, so it can go forwards or backwards, and that way you can cut either left-hand threads or right-hand threads by pulling this lever up or down. Up is with the tool approaching the chuck, and that makes right-hand threads. If you put it down, you get a left-hand thread. This is the stud gear, and that's the main one you normally change to get different speeds if you're cutting speeds, or also for different threads per inch or pitch. Then we've got this compound gear here, which is a conversion gear. Again, that's actually a slightly different one from the one we just looked at. I like it better because it's really accurate conversion. And this wheel has 100 teeth on it, and the one next to it has 127. And then that drives the standard lead screw gear, which is 56 teeth. And so this is a pretty standard setup for converting an imperial lathe to metric. And how does it do that? Well, for a start, this is a 40-tooth stud gear here, and the normal setup is 20-tooth, so you're doubling your speed there for a start. So this gear at 127 teeth doubled gives you 254 and allows you to convert inches to millimeters, and there are 25.4 millimeters in an inch, so that gives you an exact conversion. When it comes to changing around the gears in the gear train, the gears are mounted in these slots and can slide in and out so that different size wheels can mesh together. And that is called either a banjo or a quadrant. Just here, I don't know whether you can see my arrow, but there's just here in about the middle of the screen on the right, there's a square nut, screw you'd call it, which clamps the banjo or quadrant. And if you loosen that screw, you can shift the position of the quadrant and get the teeth meshing properly. As you can imagine, if you can move the quadrant up and down, you can make these gear wheels move closer together. And this is the edge view of it, which gives you a better idea of how they run together. So you've got your spindle driving the tumbler gears, and I forgot to mention that this tumbler gear drives the stud gear. But the number of teeth on this little gear in the back of the stud is actually a compound gear as well with a key in it. This has the same number of teeth as the spindle, and so the stud gear turns at exactly the same speed as a spindle. So that means you can ignore all this part. The tumbler gears can be ignored, and this stud gear is a substitute for spindle speed. So the spindle speed drives this wheel, which is currently a 40-tooth gear, drives the 127-tooth gear, and in front of that you've got an 80-tooth gear, which then drives the 56-tooth gear on the lead screw. So that's how it's all put together. To do this, you sometimes have to put spacers or little small gears that you're not using in behind one of the wheels, like behind this stud wheel gear, to make them go into the right position so they mesh properly. So this lathe has been converted from imperial to metric. And if you want to go back to imperial, you just take this combination wheel off and put another idler wheel in there. And by the way, the idler wheel, instead of being a double compound wheel, is only a single wheel. And then you don't need the spacer in here. You can bring this gear wheel across and it'll mesh directly to idler wheel. The idler wheel doesn't have any effect at all on the gear ratio of the chain as a whole. And you'll hear me talking later about the gear train ratio. That's the effect that this whole chain of gear wheels has on the relationship between the spindle speed and the lead screw speed. By the way, if you had wanted 8 threads per inch and the thread on the lead screw is also 8 threads per inch, the overall ratio of this combined with the gearbox would need to be 1:1, wouldn't it? So that every turn on the spindle results in the lead screw turning once and advancing 1/8 of an inch. This plaque on the side of the lathe tells you then how you can set up the system to cut metric threads on an imperial lathe. So once you've got one of these pair of conversion gears in, the 6380 works the same way as the other one we were just talking about. And so if you wanted a pitch of say 1.75, you would look for the 56-tooth gear and put that on the stud gear. That's interesting because the lead screw gear is also 56, so to do that you'd have to have two 56 wheels. And you'd put the bigger box on C1. So this is actually just another photo of the banjo we were talking about without the gears on it, so you can get a clearer idea of what it looks like. You can see it's got a little split in here and a screw across it. And you can see here the levers that you move in different positions to change gear on the gearbox. it's getting a little bit more technical here, and you don't really need to know exactly how all this works, but I think it's interesting. I've already actually alluded to it. The method that I devised myself for working out the threads per inch has simplified things a lot. That is by assigning these numbers to the positions on the gear levers. So again, this is the imperial lathe, and you have numbers 1 to 16 on the letters A to E on one lever, and the other lever you set has got numbers on it, numbers 1 to 8, but the numbers assigned to those positions are 8 to 14. If you want to know how many threads per inch you're going to get with any particular setting, you just multiply these numbers together, but you have to do a little bit more manipulation as well. Interestingly, when you want to do 8 threads per inch and you want an overall gear ratio of 1 to 1, the gearbox doesn't actually produce a 1 to 1 gear ratio. It's actually 1 over 2.8 to 1. So what they have to do is arrange standard gear wheels that give you this ratio. They have a 56 to 20 as a standard gear train, 20 on the stud gear and 56 on the lead screw, and that gives a factor of 2.8 in the gear train, which compensates for the 1 over 2.8 gear ratio in the gearbox. So that's a bit of a maneuver that takes place without you really realizing it. Let's say we've got 4 gears in our chain. We've got the stud gear, 2 compound gears, and the lead screw gear. Well, actually, I positioned stud gear and lead screw gear first together here because often they're used with just an idler in between, which doesn't do anything. But if you add in the compound gears, they're called 2 and 3, that has to be taken into account as well. So first you calculate the gear train ratio, the gear ratio of the whole gear train, and that's gear 1 over gear 4 multiplied by gear 3 over gear 2. Fairly straightforward. You can look at that closely and figure out what it all means. And then you have to multiply that by this primary ratio of 1 over 2.8, which I've just explained as the intrinsic gear ratio of the gearbox, and I call the primary ratio. That's just a name that I just made up. I had to call it something. So that when you come to actually finally calculate the threads per inch, you take this primary ratio, the 1 over 2.8, multiplied by the F factor, which comes from multiplying these terms on the lever. So this lever number multiplied by this one is the F factor. And once you've got that, you divide by the gear train ratio you've just calculated. So that gives you the threads per inch, and you can then calculate the error by comparing the threads per inch that you just calculated with what you require. So the user is saying, okay, well, I want 24 threads per inch, and you got 23.9, then you can calculate the percentage error. And if you're using metric, or need a metric equivalent, you can take the pitch and take 25.4 divided by threads per inch gives you metric. Interestingly, the pitch is inversely related to threads per inch. So in other words, the threads per inch is on the bottom line and the pitch is on the top line over here. This whole system was derived just by examining this table. So here are the numbers I'm actually using: 8, 9, 10, 11, 11.5, 12, 13, 14. It actually corresponds to a set of gears inside the gearbox that have actually double this number of teeth on each gear wheel. So it actually relates physically to what's inside the gearbox. So I've just explained how we calculate this primary ratio by knowing that the lead screw is 8 threads per inch and that we need an overall ratio of 1 to 1. I was able to derive this primary ratio. This just goes through how that's done mathematically. And then we come to the metric lathe and we do the same thing all over again. And here's the plaque that's off the side of the gearbox on a metric lathe. This has a lead screw of 3 millimeters pitch, and here in the middle of the left hand side you can see there's a particular setting that gives you 3 millimeters pitch. It's 1 on the numbered lever and D on the right hand lever, the letter, what I call the letter lever. And it's using a stud gear of 20 teeth. And by putting all that together, you can use that data to calculate the primary ratio that you need for these calculations. Doing metric threads on an imperial lathe, and there's a huge number of different size gears they're using here, so I put them all on my list as being gears that might be available, but it's actually a bit of a ridiculously long list. Okay, so I devised basically the same system for the metric one. Well, it actually comes about a bit differently, but these are the numbers assigned to the number lever, and the values are assigned to the letter lever. You multiply them together to get the F value, and I'll just zoom down here and look at the equation that we finally use. You calculate the gear train ratio same as before, gear 1 over gear 4 times gear 3 over gear 2, and we multiply that by the primary ratio, which you calculate in the same way, and multiply by F, and that gives the pitch. And that's all there is to it. And what you'll notice is different is that in this case you multiply by the gear train ratio, whereas on the imperial version you divide by the gear train ratio. The primary ratio, involving the fact that things are inverted, comes out to 0.05625. Interestingly, this is a label from the side of one of the Boxford Model B and C lathes. Well, they're the ones that don't have gearboxes, so then it gets much more complicated. You can see all these complex kind of gear systems they're using. This one here in the middle is the standard type of setup we were just looking at, where you've got the stud gear driving a compound gear with 127 teeth on one and 100 on the other, and it's driving the screw gear. So in this middle section here, that's all using figure 2, that standard type of setup, and they recommend using this stud gear combined with this lead screw gear, and that'll give you the required pitch and metric. But if you start getting to extremes, you get these very complicated setups. They've got one compound pair driving another compound pair and then going to the lead screw gear. However, if you run my software, you'll find that there are much simpler solutions to this if you're prepared to accept, say, 0.01% accuracy or something. It actually gets around some of the complexity. There is software for the PC that I've found does work much the same way as mine. But I think mine is very easy to use, and already people are saying that they're putting it on their iPads and using it in their workshop on the spot where they need it, and that's a convenience of having it online. Here we have a list of South Bend 9-inch clones, and Tony of lathes.co.uk mentioned that there are probably more than 22 different companies making these lathes, and this is a selection of names that he had on this list. Harrison's actually bought Boxford, but they kept selling Boxfords under the same name, so they're related. Hercus and Purcell, I believe, are in Australia. I know I spoke to somebody already who's been using my software in Australia. And there's some in South Africa and various European countries, and of course a lot in England and America. This is my Boxford lathe. When I inherited it from my father, it needed a good clean-up, and so I got one. So that's what it looks like now. It's my father teaching my son how to use the lathe in his workshop. So we can go back to data entry, and one thing that I worked on was making sure that the data that you've entered is still there when you go back to it. So here's the data entry page we come back to, and it's got all the same settings on it that we had originally, but we can go back and edit and change things. So let's say we'd like to see what happens if we have a metric lathe and we're going to do an imperial thread. In this case we might say we want to use 20 threads per inch and find out what gear combinations will do that. I think we'll find that relatively easy to solve. So let's try putting this into 0 so that there's no error, so we only find very accurate results, and let's see what that comes up with. I won't put any extra gears in, we've already got a big selection. Now it's taking a few seconds to load. So we're producing 20 threads per inch with 0% accuracy, and there was 156 results. Oh wow, it looks at 1.8 million gear combinations. That's why it took a little while. It thinks that one of the best results is 156. Actually, it just goes through the list looking for the smallest error as it goes through, and the last entry, which has a small error, is the one that's reported. So in this case they're all 0, and that's why the one with the best accuracy is at number 156, and there's 156 on the list, so it's not a coincidence. So there's all our results. We want 20 threads per inch, getting it spot on, 0% accuracy, with a stud gear of 20, and then there's 2 compound gears, and they put together in all sorts of different combinations. That may not be as easy as it sounds if those gears have been riveted together and you have to drill the rivet out and work out how to connect them back together again, so actually it's not necessarily trivial. And they're driving a particular lead screw gear and use these gearbox settings. Now what would happen if we, say for example, didn't have a gearbox? Well, let's go back to our data entry, and we'll say no screw cutting gearbox, submit the ticket. There are only 3 results this time, but you can do it, and it only had 114,000 combinations to check. So we've got 3 results using, say, 16 on the stud gear, compound gear, and 80 on the lead screw gear, and that gives you completely accurate results. So that's quite a good example where it's only got 3 results because we chose 0% error. Then we've got a large selection of gears to choose from too, and compound gears. Now another option might be, let's say we have got a gearbox and we're not going to use compound gears because they're too complicated to set up, as I was just saying. So we'll see what happens then. Oops, no solution to this one. No solution found for a thread with 20 threads per inch varying the stud and lead screw gear only with 0% error. Well, there's an interesting case where we didn't get any results because we had 0%, but what if we say put 1% on here? And now we've got 53 results after going through 6,000 different combinations. But you notice now we've only got 2 columns here, the stud gear and lead screw gear, but no compound gears in between, and we have got the gearbox. And so 53 results, and the errors on these are reasonably small, like 0.1367 is the best. We'll say no, we haven't got a gearbox, and we're not going to use compounds either, but we are willing to have 1% error. Let's see what we get. 1 result. Only 420 possible gear combinations with that, but if you have no compounds and no gearbox, even putting a stud gear of 16 and a lead screw of 38 will give you 20 threads per inch. So there you go, that's fairly straightforward solutions. There are some optional entries here where you can put in your own selection of compound gears and your own selection of change gears, and you can delete the existing lists, so you only have your data in there and not mine. And run the program and see how you do. So say we had a 56 tooth gear and a 16. I don't know whether we'll find any solutions for this, we'll see. We want to delete the current lists and see what happens. Delete existing change gears, and instead we'll use our own change gears, which was 56 and 16. I better put 38 in there as well, since that was one of the solutions. And there it is, 16 and 38. But the list of gears in there is only those ones that I put in, 56, 16 and 38, and all the ones I had in there before have been deleted. And it'll stay like that as long as you keep running the program, although of course if you shut the web page down and come back later, it'll have my list back again. So I think I've hammered that to death and described everything for you. I hope you enjoy the software. It is free, and let's go back to the top and remind you about the web page. Hero's Steam Engine, just HERO, steamengine.com/RideTheGearTrain. And I think if you forget that, you'll find that it'll soon be on Google, because it's such an unusual and corny name that you'll be able to find it on Google pretty easily. Well, happy turning.